Hi, Misha here, and in this episode of looking at Japanese warships, we're into the carriers. These are the big fleet carriers, the Kaga and the Akagi. But I thought before we get to those, let's talk about this kind of funny little carrier, the Ryūjō, which was only one of its class. It's a light carrier, and the name means prancing dragon. Again, those poetic names. And this was only one of its class for a good reason. In 1928, the Japanese Navy designed this to be a carrier under 10,000 tons and carrying about 24 aircraft. Why under 10,000 tons? Because there was a loophole in the Washington Naval Treaty, which basically didn't count carriers under 10,000 tons towards the overall tonnage limit. So she was laid down in 1929, but while she was under construction, the London Naval Treaty corrected this loophole, plugged it, meaning that while Japan was allowed to continue, they would have no incentive to build more of this class because this would count as tonnage. So with that, she was launched in 1931 early, and then commissioned initially in 1932. Now, one change that was made, like I said, originally she was to carry 24 aircraft. The Navy wanted her to carry 48 to make her more useful, which makes sense. They're starting to see new carrier doctrines and whatnot at this point. So their solution was to simply put a hangar deck on top of the existing hangar deck, which, as you would imagine, did expand her carrying capacity. It also made her very top-heavy. Now, this model here is from Eaglemoss, and it is circa 1932 or 33, I forget which. So this is in its original configuration before it was refit. By the way, the Hosho that I showed in the previous video was circa 1942. Not that it really matters. And this is a more capable carrier, built using the lessons from Hosho, but not much bigger. It's about 590 feet long. It is capable of 29 knots. Had a crew starting off at 600. Had some basic air defense type guns. Only had 2 elevators. And, yeah, it could nominally carry 48 planes, but in reality, it typically operated with around 28 to 38. And she would be evaluated in 1933 and 34. She would go in for a minor refit to correct some perceived issues. She was top-heavy, no surprise there, so they started trying to work on that. She was back out on fleet maneuvers in 1935 when she was caught in the same typhoon that damaged Hosho. So she was back to the naval yards at the end of 1935 to correct damage. And while they were at it, they decided to rebuild her. And this would last until 1936. In this rebuild, they would lengthen the flight deck a bit. Initially, she would weigh about 8,000 tons light, or just not equipped, and a little over 10,000 fully loaded up. After the refit, they would add weight. She would be about 10,500 tons light and over 12,000 tons loaded up, so that helped a bit. They would update her air defenses and correct some of the issues with her flight deck and they would increase the personnel on board to about 900. She would also start to receive more modern aircraft. So she was back in service after a brief time in and out of reserve and as a training ship, and she would first see combat in 1937. Like Ryūjō, she would be used beginning in August in the Second Sino-Japanese War. Her planes would engage the enemy that month. She would also send dive bomb attacks against Chinese cities. Interestingly, she had been one of the early test beds for Japanese dive bombers dating back all the way to 1934. And then she would actually be given some new models in 36 after her refit. They would leave her, then she'd get some back. So yeah, she was kind of an early test bed for new dive bombing tactics. And they quickly decided they liked dive bombers more than torpedo bombers, at least for most situations. In 1938, she would get the A5M Claude. And then she would be used as a training ship briefly. And by 1940, she would start to operate the B5N Kate, something that the Ryūjō could not do. The only problem was one of her two elevators was honestly too small to be useful at this point, so she effectively became a single elevator aircraft carrier. And again, she is still pretty cramped. This is still a small ship for having up to 48 airplanes on board, and that was designed to be 48 old biplane style airplanes too. So when you get to the larger monoplanes, a little bit different story. During the invasion of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, she would start to be operating the A6M-0, and she would not be tasked to go to Hawaii. Instead, she would be part of the invasion force on the Philippines. She would provide covering. She would also send out bombing attacks, and so on and so forth. Ryūjō, or Ryūjō, would end 1941 by helping sink a British oil tanker. And she would be very busy. And in 1942, she would support other landings and invasions. In February, she would lay in wait, and her aircraft would attack ships leaving Singapore. She would damage 8 ships there and sink 4. On the 14th, she would actually be attacked by Bristol Blenheims, but escape with very minor damage. Then the next day, her planes would attack the HMS Exeter, and in return do very minor damage. So kind of a draw there. Coming into March, she would assist in the Second Battle of the Java Sea. And after that, for the rest of the month, she pretty much would be a convoy escort. Then in April, she decided to switch roles and become basically a commerce raider. Her and a small task group of cruisers and destroyers would attack several merchant ships and small ships, claiming a total of 19 sunk in that month. And towards the end, she would be sent back to port for repair and refit because she'd been an active prancing dragon. And from that point, she would begin training for the Midway campaign. However, she would not be part of the main Midway group. Instead, she would be part of the task force that would be sent north to attack the Aleutian Islands, Alaska. She would leave for this on June 1st. And then beginning around June 3rd into June 4th, she would start attacking Dutch Harbor. Now the weather was pretty piss poor, so she actually lost a plane at take off. But despite the bad weather, they actually did hit their target, doing some pretty significant damage to the oil storage facilities there, as well as the military barracks, and taking out a few aircraft on the ground, float planes, and what have you. She would kind of remain in the general area throughout the rest of June, leaving around July 8th, returning to port on the 13th for resupply. From that point, she would be sent out to assist in the whole Guadalcanal campaign in August. And that would be where she would meet her end. On August 24th, she would be in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. And first aircraft from the USS Enterprise would try attacking her. Pretty ineffective. Next, the aircraft from USS Saratoga would give it a go, and much more effective. They hit her with at least 3 bombs and 1 torpedo. She was listing and wasn't long for this world. Her escorting destroyers took off as many crew as they could. Of the 900 some odd crew, 120 perished, including some aviators who, while returning from a raid, came back to find their home base not there, or if they're way too brightly lit up. So at any rate, she was at the bottom. And yeah, you can tell this is when things started to go not the way of the Japanese Navy. This is just a couple months after Midway. And so this is at a time when they needed every carrier they had. And while she wasn't the biggest or the most capable, at the end, her last mission, she was carrying around 24 Zeros and 9 B-5N bombers. So again, like I said, around 33. Pretty common for her. She really didn't have the space for a full 48 with the modern planes, but nevertheless, a capable ship, and at 29 knots, not the slowest in the world either. Not bad for something that the Japanese kind of just built to be cheeky and try to subvert the Washington Naval Treaty. Interesting ship design, how tall and stacked up it is too. Of course, her anti-aircraft armament would change over the war as any ship would, but being sunk in mid-42, she didn't get a lot of the later wars things like radar. This model here still shows her with biplanes on board and whatnot. But an interesting little ship. I like carriers in general, and they're actually pretty hard to find in the Eagle Moss collection. They make several, but these are all imported models, so you kind of take what you can get. And light carriers are interesting too, for what they are. Alright, for real next time we'll get to the big fleet carriers. I just had time to do this shorter video in between other events, so I need a little more time to do this video. But I'll get it taken care of. I appreciate you tuning in. If you have any questions or comments, please do post them below. And as always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon. Next time.